Hello, fellow griever. This is the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I am Melissa, your host. This week, you have found yourself with me for one of my shorter, solo, down the rabbit hole episodes. Here, I take you with me on a journey of sorts, through thoughts in my own griefy mind. Some days, I may tackle topics as if I am in Alice's shoes, slaying the Jabberwocky. And on others, I may end up in my own pool of tears. Or I may just go a bit sideways and paint the proverbial roses red. But I always promise an adventure. So let's dive down the rabbit hole and see just what sorts of madness we might discover together. I am glad you have joined me, because while I do know how lonely this grief is, I also believe we needn't be alone. Welcome. Hello, fellow griever, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 22 of the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I'm Melissa, your host. And today, the title of the episode is Life After Suicide Loss, It's Okay to Be Okay. And first of all, that's not a typo. We're so used to hearing it's okay not to be okay that you may have thought I omitted a word, but I did not. That's actually what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll get to explaining why in just a quick second, but I'm going to read a quote first. The weird thing about devastating loss is that life actually goes on. When you're faced with a tragedy, a loss so huge that you have no idea how you can live through it, somehow the world keeps turning. The seconds keep ticking. It's a quote by the author James Patterson from his book Angel. And I just thought it was a good way to kick off this discussion, because that is the thing about devastating loss, is so many of us, especially initially, actively thought things like, how in the world are all those people out there doing things? Don't they know that I lost my son, in the case of me? Or whatever, in your case it could be, or you lost your husband or your friend. And we think how audacious of the world to continue to spin and go on. And for life as, quote, normal, unquote, continues to go on for so many people when we feel like our entire earth blew out from underneath us. So now back to why the topic is it's okay to be okay. And I just talked about in this quote how we're completely devastated, right? And that we're shocked that the world goes on. And that often plunges us into a deep, dark place that we may or may not have ever seen before. But the reason we're talking about this is because this topic came up recently in one of my online moms community meetings that I have every week. And just as a sidebar, we have such meaningful conversations in that space from mom to mom. And I believe that the conversations are so meaningful because the connections are so deep. And as a group, they're healing together because they've found a safe space to do that. And so the topics get real and deep on a regular basis. And this one came up because we were discussing National Suicide Prevention Month, which is the whole month of September. And World Suicide Prevention Day was actually just a day ago at the time of this recording. This recording won't be out until Sunday the 15th, but at the time of the recording, it was just yesterday, National Suicide Prevention Day, which is September 10th. And I said that incorrectly. Please forgive me. World Suicide Prevention Day. But that day in my world is my youngest son, Parker's birthday. And so if you're wondering why you didn't see Melissa put something out that day, that's why. But I'll get to the complicated reason in just a minute that ties into today's episode. But with September 10th, in my world, that's my youngest son's birthday. He lost his very closest connection on this planet on August 7th of 2016 when his brother Alex died by suicide. Our life is overshadowed, even if only by the smallest amount on a day. Even on the best day, it's still overshadowed on some level by suicide. My life, my children's lives, everybody that's close to us, on some level, suicide has overshadowed our whole life. So I choose on September 10th to acknowledge my son's birthday and not have suicide be what I focus on that day. Now, that doesn't mean it leaves. You all know that, but it just means that's why I do that. So let's go back to the discussion at hand and talk about why we're talking about this. And, the overarching reason is because what I discuss here on this podcast is to help normalize or give you permission to understand the normal parts of this loss and the behaviors that we have that accompany them. And as a survivor of suicide loss, to say the least, our feelings are complex about suicide in general. But then you add in the word prevention, and it really becomes a conundrum for us survivors. Because, and just to be clear, it's the rhetoric, it's the wording, and the social talk around suicide prevention that becomes complicated and hard for us. It isn't because we are in any way against suicide prevention, because obviously, I would assume most of you listening are suicide loss survivors yourself. Obviously, I am, and I'm sure you are, very pro-suicide prevention. We want every suicide that can be prevented to be prevented. But after we've lost somebody to suicide, and especially with so many of us that didn't see it coming, the rhetoric that's out there in the month of September, letting us know from many resources that there's people that feel every suicide is preventable, and there's people that feel that only talking about suicide prevention is what matters, and it stings. It stings us because we feel like we should have been able to do something to prevent our loved one's suicide. And because we didn't, that immense guilt creeps in. And at the end of the day, most of us probably could have done absolutely nothing. That's a place that you get to at some point, is knowing that and believing it in yourself. But especially in the early years, many suicide loss survivors have to kind of turn another cheek on Suicide Prevention Month and not maybe watch social media quite so much. Because while there's some perfectly lovely, amazing things out there, and this month is vital to awareness and vital to helping more people become aware, which will then have a ripple effect at some point, hopefully, of reducing the suicide, it's still hard for us to see all that messaging. And the other side of that is, I'll tell you that the messaging's complicated and not all of it is accurate, but we've got to start somewhere. So I have, come to a peaceful relationship with the suicide prevention rhetoric that's out there. Again, I'm very for suicide prevention, but we also have to remember that part of what we need to be doing is destigmatizing. And I'm going to kind of walk away from the suicide prevention piece at this point and leave it for another day, because that's an entirely different topic that deserves its own space. But so, I came up with this topic after this meeting where we were discussing how we hear so much, it's okay to not be okay. But then the topic was brought up but for us, it often feels like it's not okay to be okay. And that's a confusing, complicated thing. I will tell you that this comes from many of the loss survivors, the moms in my suicide loss space, that are, in that past 1 year mark. They're past their survival phase. If you've been listening to me for a while, you know that I believe that the first 3 years of our loss are kind of marked by survival, hope, and healing. Not necessarily in a linear fashion. Survival tends to be that first year when you're in shock and shrouded by the cloud of grief. And at some point after that, hope will show up, and that can segue or bridge you into healing. And usually by the time you get to the end of your third year, you have seen yourself through, and I shouldn't say completed, but you've seen yourself at least go into and go through some of the feelings involved with the hope and healing. We also discussed briefly the fact that along with our own guilt comes what we feel like is judgment from others if they see us having happiness or joy. And some of them judging us the same way we're judging ourselves. But for the most part, the feeling that we were talking about was that people feel like if they show joy or happiness sometimes around, quote, normal, unquote, people, like say their coworkers or maybe a group of friends they haven't, don't see in a long time, and they show that joy, that those people then make an assumption that we are okay and have moved on and are no longer grieving the loss of our loved one. And that's a whole nother complicated feeling that we often feel. I mean, I'll tell you that there's not necessarily a lot of validity in some of it, but our feelings aren't always tied to our emotions, as we know. Meaning our feelings aren't always tied to our brain. Our brain and heart have a disconnect often. Sorry, I said that backwards. But we had to acknowledge that this was a real part of it, that sometimes we find ourselves thinking after we've experienced joy in a moment like that, or something, that people will be like, oh, good, she's great. I don't need to ask her about her child anymore, or I don't need to ever ask her how her days are going because she's good. You know what I mean? And what I'll tell you is that that's, not necessarily true, but we also have to get to a place to not have guilt over that, to be able to take a moment to educate people that grief continues. Grief goes on. We carry it, especially with significant loss, for the rest of our life on some level. It's how we learn to grieve that's important, but we never want people to quit asking us how we are, especially on significant dates. We never want them to not acknowledge the loss of our loved one as significant. And so the only response that we really have to that, or that we had as a group, was that sometimes one of the best things we can do in that situation, if we find that we've done that and we kind of see that relief on, I'll just use coworkers as an example, on our coworkers' face, and then we notice that maybe they're not asking us anymore because they assume that we're good or whatever, the way we can respond to them asking, how are you? Instead of just going, hey, I'm great, I'm fine, if that's really how you're feeling in the moment, but you don't want to do that because you don't want them to assume that you're good now. The best way to say is, I'm doing good today. This is a journey that's going to be different and on and off, but today I'm good. Thanks for asking, and I appreciate you asking, and lean into that and let them know, and that will help. And very soon I'm going to do an episode on what I feel like has happened, the processes that I've gone through after those years, and what it looks like for me now. But for today, I'm just going to say that this thing that I'm talking about today happens to all of us that are working to heal our trauma and move forward with our grief and seek and find happiness and joy, and hoping that it will eke in again to our lives. I remember when that happened to me, and that's what we were talking about in the room. Several of the moms were discussing the fact that over the course of the last few months, there have been more than one person in my community that has talked about feeling their first real times of joy and happiness after the loss of their child, and how it's taken them aback, how they have analyzed it after the fact of the joy and happiness and what they're doing with it now. Because often for us, at least initially, the price of that happiness starting to come back, of starting to see and feel moments of real joy again, the price for that feels like more guilt. And that's one thing that I don't know about you guys, but I definitely don't need more of is guilt. And so how do we tackle that? But before we tackle how to deal with the guilt, let's just really briefly address the why. Why do we feel so much guilt? In a nutshell, in the simplest way I know how to say it, it's because it feels like a betrayal to us. It feels like by being happy again and experiencing joy of any form, whether it's even just for a few hours, initially a few minutes of feeling that joy, and then we allow that guilt to creep back in and tell us, how can I possibly be feeling joy? And I'm just going to use my own example, my own relationship. How can I be feeling joy if my son's gone? And we could take it a step further of, I might have asked myself back in the time when I was feeling this, how could I possibly feel this joy when I couldn't prevent my son's suicide? My son didn't just die in an accident. My son ended his life, and there should have been something I could do. How could I possibly ever feel or deserve to feel joy again? Those are the questions. That's what comes into our head. That's what we allow to take over. And then we've added more guilt. So now joy has eked its way back in, and we've added more guilt, which then causes many people to avoid situations that caused the joy. Like if they know what they did that caused them joy, then they're going to feel guilty if they want to go do that again. I have to tell you, as hard as this is to hear, the first time you see glimmers of joy and hope, you should make note of what has caused that. You should make note of the guilt that it's causing so that you can reckon with both. One, so that you remember and recall and cement into your mind that it was good that you felt the joy. But the only way to do that is to deal with that guilt, right? The first thing I want to do is tell you that it's perfectly normal to feel that way. But in fact, joy and sadness can absolutely coexist. And it's the opposite that we should be feeling. We should be feeling relief that joy has eked in. We should be feeling joy that we're starting to remember their amazing life and what an amazing person they were, and that we're allowing ourselves to feel that in moments that it's appropriate, that it's replacing the overwhelming sadness that everything brought to us again before. And we should celebrate the fact that if joy is eking back in, we're doing a good job at replacing old messaging in our brain and reframing it with new messaging that allows us to feel that joy. But what if everything I just said in the last 30 seconds feels like gobbledygook to you? You don't understand what that means about replacing or reframing. And either you haven't felt much joy yet because you won't allow yourself, or you have and you've allowed the guilt to squash you from continuing to feel it. Here's some ways that you could ease the guilt and start leaning into those moments of joy so you can feel some relief from the guilt, so that you can start to replace those guilt feelings with just letting that joy live where it belongs in those moments. Here's a couple of things you can do. You can give yourself, and should absolutely be giving yourself, a time and space for your grief. And yeah, that means I always encourage grief rituals of some sort, whether that's, for most moms, it's daily things, whether it's in the morning, talking to your child in spirit while you have your coffee. I encourage journaling, whether it's writing letters and journaling to your child so that you can say the things you need to say. There's lots of things you can do to create space for your grief so you have time. For me, yoga and meditation is a part of that. Listening to a grief playlist or looking at photos when I need to honor space for grief is one of the things I do. Because it's not that I always need to cry, but if what I need to do is cry and feel the sadness of the loss, I allow myself that space so that I can move forward into my day or moments or whatever the case might be, to be able to experience life, which does include joy sometimes. The second thing I recommend that you can do is remember that they want you to be happy. And if you cringed a little bit, I understand, because that's one of the phrases that we as suicide loss survivors, as grievers, cringe when other people, meaning people that are not immediately in our small loss circle, say they would want you to be happy. It tends to make us cringe. It's kind of along the lines of things like, well, they're in a better place. Doesn't matter. They should be here, right? So, but I will tell you that when we live inside of a glass house, we can cast our own stones, right? And I am a part of the same space you are. I too have lost my child. And so I will tell you that I know at this point, for a matter of fact, that Alex would only want my life and his brother and sister's life and everybody that loved him's life to be good and full and happy. There wasn't any part of him that intended to make anybody miserable. He actually lived trying to do the opposite for people. He wanted everybody to get along and be happy and not be stressed. Those were some of the hallmark things of Alex's personality. So on some level, a suicide is counterintuitive. But the bigger picture of that, and again, I won't go down this additional rabbit hole today, is that because that's who he was, it almost seems, and I know many people share that characteristic, their child does with mine, that they wanted everybody to be happy. So how is it this could have been what they chose? So this part just really highlights the fact that their brain in those moments and days and hours before loss was not in a place of having sane, rational thought. Because at least in the case of my son, the last thing he would have been intending to do is hurt anyone or make anyone have anything extra to carry, because he lived to strive for exactly the opposite with the people that he loved. The third thing you can do is find joy. And I say find joy because she's hiding, at least for a while. She absolutely is after loss. So you may have to seek it. You may have to seek out joy or even chase it. That's what when we went into the motorhome, if you don't know that part of my story, I do talk about it at some point early in the podcast. But we sold everything, our businesses, our home, and everything. After Alex had been gone about 18 months, we started the process. And by the second year, we were on the road traveling with the intention of traveling for a few years to try to figure this out. Our life had been decimated. It didn't make sense as it was anymore. And so that was a choice that we made. But I set out on that journey saying fairly early on that I felt like I was chasing joy. I didn't know where I was going to find it. And does that mean I really thought I was going to find it in Arizona, for example? No, it wasn't that literal. It was more just about, for me, stripping my life back down to the bare necessities and relieving myself of the stress of being in my home and all the different things. I had no children left at home. Parker had gone to college, and the businesses didn't make sense anymore. All the things didn't make sense. So we kind of set out on a journey to chase joy and find where we could be happy again. Did I believe I deserved to be happy again or could find it again? No, not initially. In my feelings, in my heart, my head did. My head knew from everything I saw out there from other grievers that had gone before me that it was possible. So I was convinced that she was on some level hiding. And I know I'm saying she. That's because I am kind of referencing the movie Inside Out, which has, in the last few months ago, released Inside Out 2. It's a Disney Pixar movie. If you're not familiar with it because you don't have little kids in your life or something, it's actually one I would recommend even for adults. Inside Out and Inside Out 2, just because they deal with emotions so well. There's very little critique. I mean, there's always a little that we can make, but there's very little critique I have of how they handle even the psychology of these emotions. And they have new emotions show up in Inside Out too. But anyway, Joy's a character in that movie, and obviously present in all of our personalities. And just like we experience in life, we feel like joy and sadness are counterintuitive to each other, that they can't be one and the same. And they're not the same thing. But many of us think we have to choose joy or sadness. And you guys know I live in an and world. Joy and sadness can live together. They can coexist, and they actually need each other. And so for us to think that we're going to leave sadness alone without joy the rest of our lives isn't fair to us, and it absolutely isn't fair to the amazing life and legacy that our child has left behind, or our loved one has left behind, right? So seek joy, find joy. Joy begets joy. Find safe spaces to create even moments of joy. And I say safe spaces because I have witnessed many grieving moms experience joy, real joy, belly laughing joy that kind of, lifts their endorphins for the first time in the company of other moms. And that's a safety piece. And I can unwind that greater on another day. But, I had several of the moms at the last Moms Healing Retreat say, and they were there, some of the moms were as early as 6 months in their loss, some were as far out as 4 and 5 years. And I still had several of them say this was the first place they felt like they had allowed joy to really come in. And we discussed the guilt that came with it and things like that, even at that retreat, because this is a real issue that we face. So the fourth thing you can do to ease the guilt and start leaning into joy and feel some relief of that guilt is be good to yourself. Make sure you're instituting good self-care. Yes, I cringe. Those words get overused, but make sure you're instituting good ways to love yourself and create at least calm and peace for yourself, because calm and peace will give way to joy at some point, right? So we might have to take steps, especially if you're earlier. If you're still in your first year, I always say space and grace, space and grace. It's going to be hard. You're under a cloud. You'll go in and out of different feelings, and there's going to be so much that you may not remember all of because you're being protected more than you know. So I'm talking a little bit more to people that are past their first year. However, this is not any less relevant for those of you that are earlier in your grief, because I want this to be a beacon of hope, that you'll get there, that you'll get to a place that you're not only going to be able to see that there's a hope for joy, but you'll be able to start to desire to want to feel joy and happiness again. And that guilt's going to eke in, and I want you to remember this episode and come back to addressing the guilt with me by listening again if you need to. So by being good to yourself and having self-care and all of that, to me, as a 4A or a sub piece to that would be, if you need to, if this isn't something you're at a place that you've worked through naturally and the guilt is just too immense, consider some therapy tools. And by I mean things that would be administered by therapists, things like neuro-linguistic programming, brain spotting, EMDR. Brain spotting is just the bigger cousin of EMDR. I'm a big fan of all of these things, because what you sometimes need to help with the guilt, to do the reframing I talked about earlier and replacing old messages with new ones, is you have to get into your subconscious and, replace these old thoughts that are causing you to have trauma come up and the guilt to take over. We have to reframe messages in our mind, and that can only be done with our subconscious, which is where most of our actions are controlled by. So that's even where our triggers are coming from and our automatic responses that we feel like we don't have as much control over as we do our waking thoughts. And then before we know it, we're just mired in the muck of guilt again. So these are tools that are out there that are available to help people. I'm not necessarily endorsing any of them particularly. I'm just saying that, some of them have been very powerful in my life, and I've seen many of them be very powerful in other loss survivors' lives, and it's something to consider. Just my opinion, but it's something to consider as a resource. I will put a couple of links in the show notes to places you can find out more about these so you would know whether any of these therapies might be right for you to help with your reframing and to get you to a place that you're starting to move towards some joy and happiness in life without the immense guilt. I will also link to the trailer for those Inside Out movies in case you want to see what they're about. But I also want to go back and make sure I mention that I did talk about the moms that came to the retreat. So be sure that if you're listening and you're a mom or you know a mom, because who doesn't have a mom? I realize some of our moms are no longer with us. But if you have a mom or know a mom or are a mom and are interested in a deeper connection with your child spiritually while healing and getting your soul refreshed, consider my January Moms Soul Spirit Connection Retreat. I only have 3 spots left. So it's almost full at the time of this recording, the initial recording. So please go to my website. I'll put a link in the show notes, but you can also just go to my website and check out that retreat before it's full if you're interested. Also, if you aren't already signed up for my newsletter, it's really not a big newsletter, but I do send out a small email every week to just touch base. Once in a while, I don't send one out, but most weeks I do. And I have had a big announcement in this last newsletter that I will be talking about on the podcast soon. But I just want to nudge you that if you're not getting that letter, you're not getting some of the announcements. Usually I'm just chatting and sharing tips and touching base, but it's also where any new announcements might go that I feel like the community might want to know about. And I want to end today by making an offer to you. If you've made it all the way to the end of this episode, and in talking about joy coming back in and the guilt associated with it, I want to refer back to me talking about the healing that we do. You remember survival, hope, and healing. And after hope shows up and these glimmers start to show up, it helps bridge us towards healing. In order to get to a place of rebuilding again and really starting to get our footing under us, sometimes what we have to do is really dig into our trauma piece. You guys have heard me talk about trauma versus grief. They're not the same, but they do interact and they do sometimes overshadow each other, and many people don't understand the difference. So with today's discussion, I feel like it's really relevant to offer you, if you're listening to this, a deal for my Growth to Grief course. The code will only be given here in the podcast and in the show notes. The code will stay good for the rest of this year, so through the end of December of this year. And it will allow you to download that 6-week course that is about trauma and understanding how trauma has affected us and our thinking. And this code will allow you to download that episode for only $49. It's going to give you $28, almost $30 off. It's normally $77. And even at that $77, the value is huge. Like there's a ton of information in this course. So the code, and if you don't get it written down because you're driving or something, it is in the show notes, or you could always go back to this place and pause it. The code is capital letters TLP POD 49. So think the leftover pieces pod 49. Again, the code is TLP pod 49. The link will be in the show notes. I hope that you are gentle with yourself. I hope that you give yourself all of the space and grace that you need. I will keep every one of you and your loved one in my thoughts and my heart. And until next time, fellow griever, talk soon. So we'll conclude here for today, but I just wanted to say a few things before you go. If you're new to the podcast and have not listened to the very first episode called Intro Episodes Start Here, all the way back at the beginning of season 1, I would encourage you to do so that you know what to expect from the leftover pieces. Because I do have several different styles of episodes that I record, and we do release weekly, almost all of the time. So I hope that you will come back often to join us in this community of suicide loss survivors. If you have not already, also, I would encourage you to check out theleftoverpieces.com, where you can find and have access to all of the things that I currently offer. Some of those things are online Zoom support groups, links to my books, educational opportunities that I'm adding all the time, as well as different downloadables and resources for all suicide loss survivors. And if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, or you'd just like to connect with me for any other reason, you can do it through the website as well. So until next time, I just want to remind you that I know how lonely this grief is, but you don't have to be alone. Talk soon.